The market organizational S structure. The conceptual framework, as noted in the introduction, market profile is a deck and ion support tool, not a trading system. In order to use the market profile tools, you have to know what makes them work. That's why we're going to start with the conceptual framework. Don't worry if you don't grasp the organizing principles immediately. We'll be using them over and over again, so they will be old friends by the time we're done. While you may not sense the importance of these principles initially, understanding how they relate to market activity is critical. Why? Because these organizing principles explain why market activity and not arbitrary or random. Peter Steidelmayer recognized this organizational structure and related it to an overall framework. The idea for the market profile product was conceived by him, and the CBOT product is based on his original research. Steidelmayer identified recurring behavior patterns in the trading pit and then asked himself why they were occurring. Therefore, even though the market profile vocabulary may seem unfamiliar at first, it simply describes and explains what is happening in the marketplace. As we work with the data, keep in mind that each piece of information is not an indicator by itself. You'll see that we put several pieces of information together in order to come to a conclusion. It's also important to recognize that your market decisions are always going to require judgment. Market profile can't change that. Unfortunately, it can't predict the future, but then nothing can. What market profile can do is help you to understand the present. And if you understand what's happening now in the present, you can make better decisions. With that said, we can begin our discussion of the market's organizational structure as outlined by Steidelmayer. You'll see for yourself as we move forward that no matter how sophisticated your market profile analysis becomes, it is always going to rest on these basic principles. 1. The auction framework. The purpose of a marketplace is to facilitate trade. What does that mean? In the broadest sense, it simply means that as the price moves up, it brings in more buying, or as the price moves down, it brings in more selling. The marketplace facilitates trade with the dual auction process. Basically, the market auctions up until there are no more buyers. Then it reverses and moves down until there are no more sellers. The end of an up auction is the beginning of a down auction, etc. All market activity occurs within this broad framework, with the market moving up to shut off buying and down to shut off selling. Getting a little more specific, we can say that the market begins, moves directionally, and advertises for an opposite response to shut off the directional move. That statement is at the heart of the market's organizational structure. What does it mean? Say the market moves up directionally and the up move brings in selling. The selling is an opposite response, which 1 stops the up move, in other words, shuts off the buying, and 2 causes the market to reverse and move down. The result, the up auction ends and a down auction begins. Now let's say the market moves up and advertises for selling, but doesn't get any. Instead, it brings in more buying. Therefore, the market has to move higher to bring in an opposite response. The result, the up auction continues. At bottom, that's what you're always looking for, continuation or change. 2. The negotiating process. Now, if we get even more specific, we can say that a directional move establishes parameters that contain the auction's price range, an unfair low at the low end and an unfair high at the high end. The unfair low and the unfair high are excesses. Once the market defines a range with excesses at each end, it negotiates within that range to establish value. The market trades between the established excesses until it either trades above the high excess or below the low one. Stop the market at any point in time and you'll see these 3 reference points: unfair low, unfair high, and value somewhere in between. These 3 price areas define the negotiating process, the method the marketplace uses to facilitate trade. What does this mean in a real market situation? To demonstrate, let's look at a bar chart of the Dow Jones from April 1987 to the end of October 1989. The unfair high on this chart Point A, was established in August 1987. The unfair low, point B, in October 1987. You can see that these parameters were containing the market's long-term range at that time. A new unfair high at the 2,900 level was established in June 1990. Once the parameters at A and B were established, the market negotiated between the two excesses to develop value. The negotiating process moved value up gradually from the unfair low to the unfair high. Value reached the unfair high, point C, on October 13, 1989. Because of the perception of value at that time, the market couldn't trade above the high parameter, and it reversed. The result, the excess established in 1987 continued to contain the range on the upside until June 1990. In other words, at the end of October 1989, the market attempted to take out the unfair high. However, when the United Airlines deal collapsed and seemed to indicate a possible end to leverage buyouts, market participants lost confidence and the market reversed. 3. Balance seemed imbalance. To facilitate trade in order to distribute goods and services, the market moves from imbalance to balance to imbalance and back. Again, it uses this behavior pattern in a single session and in longer-term trends or auctions. If the market is balanced, basically equal amounts of buying and selling are present, the market has brought in an opposite response. The market is rotating because it has found a fair price around which it can distribute. If the market is imbalanced, either buying or selling is predominant. The market is moving higher or lower in order to find an opposite response. The market is moving directionally because it is seeking a fair price around which it can distribute. In brief, a balanced market has found a fair price. An imbalanced market is seeking a fair price. This is simply another way to state the familiar law of supply and demand. Buyers demand and sellers supply. The market is either in equilibrium between buyers and sellers, or it is working toward that equilibrium. 4. Stoudemires tandem time frame concept. First, let's define Stoudemire's use of the term time frame. Time frames are forcing points, in other words, points in time that force a decision. These points can be imposed by the market, i.e., the close, or by something in your personal situation, i.e., you have the right to an option that expires in 2 months. To explain, say the market has been trading for 3 hours and the close is coming up in 45 minutes. If you don't want to carry the position overnight, your time is running out. The close is forcing you to make a decision within a relatively short-term time frame. You're a short-term trader in this situation because the forcing point is only 45 minutes away. You're a longer-term trader in the second situation because your option doesn't expire for 2 months. The forcing point is 2 months off. Consequently, you have a longer-term time frame in which you can operate without having to make a decision. With this insight, Stoudemire was able to divide all market activity into 2 categories, short-term and longer-term. He calls short-term activity day time frame activity. He calls longer-term activity other time frame activity. His tandem time frame concept visualizes short-term or daytime frame activity on one side of the tandem and all longer-term activity on the other side, hence the name other time frame. Since long and short-term activity exist simultaneously in the marketplace, you have to be able to separate one kind of activity from the other. We're going to separate one from the other with behavior.